Only a little fountain lent some use for ears, and on the dumb shade's language spent the music of her tears. I drew her near, and found the cistern full of divers stones, some bright and round, others ill-shaped and dull. Well, friends, these are lines from the seventh stanza of Henry Vaughan's poem Regeneration. He's our subject for today. And Vaughn, in a way, is kind of an outlier of the five metaphysical poets we'll speak about. He's the only one who wasn't a clergyman, though his twin brother Thomas was. And he's also the only one with a vested interest in Hermeticism, you would say. Hermeticism, for those of you who don't know, is philosophy. You could also call it Rosicrucianism in his case. Is a philosophy, mystical philosophy that arose around this time in history, 17th century. And it takes into account alchemy, the planets, so astrology, and other kinds of what we would call magical aspects of the universe. Now, that might seem to us weird, but that's because it seems weird to us. It wasn't weird to people at that time. And what the Vaughns were doing, and other people like Robert Flood, we'll talk a little bit about him today, what they were interested in is preserving a worldview that included the spiritual or supernatural realm alongside the natural realm that, as was coming about at this time, the scientific revolution was interested in, right? Just pure matter. So coming from René Descartes' dualism, that we can only study, and Bacon too, Francis Bacon as well, we can only study that which we can see. So we'll confine our attention to that. And even though we believe God exists, we can't study God. We can only have faith. Now, so in a way we could say the Vaughns were traditionalists, that they were rejecting this modernist view, and they were holding to the old ways. And they were you can call them conservatives in a strange way. They're also conservative in the way that they were monarchists. And as monarchists, when the Civil War in England broke out, they were enlisted in the army under the King Charles. And they both were officers. I think Henry was a captain. And Henry was injured during the war, and he went home to convalesce, which is when he wrote the first part of Salig's Centennial. So he had a religious conversion around this time. And another thing that contributed to his religious conversion was the death of their younger brother, William, which it sounds like it traumatized both brothers, so they must have been very close. And they lived in Wales, in St. Bridget's, or I think in Welsh it's Lanfranstad or something like this. I can never pronounce it. Never heard it pronounced, so I don't want to murder it. St. Bridget's is what it's called, to you and me. And later, Thomas, who was an Anglican clergyman, became the pastor of St. Bridget's until he was thrown out by the Puritans. So they were conservative traditionalists in a strange way. Now, to talk a little bit more about the Hermeticism or the Rosicrucianism, in fact, in my book, Literature and the Encounter with God in Post-Reformation England, I have a chapter on the Vaughns called The Rosicrucian Mysticism of Henry and Thomas Vaughan. And I think that's an accurate way to put what they do. And I read them both in concert. It's kind of interesting to read them in concert because Henry comes off as the introverted twin, and Thomas is the extroverted twin. At least that's how they read. Thomas is kind of bombastic and in your face, and Henry's more contemplative and quiet. Though Henry does have his moments of choler, of anger, especially when it comes to Oliver Cromwell. But So one of the places I was puzzling when I was doing the research for that book was this idea of silex. Why does Henry call his book Silex Scintillans, the sparking flint, or the scintillating flint? I couldn't figure it out. And even though he has, is the first poem in the book, which is in Latin, Authorus de se emblema, or the author's emblem of himself, that which refers to the frontispiece, right, of the stony heart being struck, right, being awakened by the hand of God, which is what I think. This is how Henry really saw his conversion. I would think. But interesting though, in that poem, I won't read the whole thing, and I won't read it in Latin either. Read the translation from French Vogel. He says, "I was deaf and dumb, a flint." Right before the divine breath softened him. And he's got other metaphors of stoniness and hardiness, But why a flint? Now I puzzled about this. And what I came to discover is that, I can't remember the year, so I'm looking it up. I was looking through all kinds of Rosicrucian stuff, and if you're ever familiar with the emblem tradition at this time, you see some of them in Jakob Burma's books, but in alchemical texts they have all these, mysterious emblems. And George Wither had put out a book of emblems, and it was kind of popular to do these emblems. Daniel Kramer did another one. But in a later Rosicrucian collection of emblems, it was put out in German called Die Geheimfiguren der Rosenkreuzer in 1785, I think it was. Yes, it was 1785. Now, in there's an image which I will show you in a second, that has at the top of the image, it's kind of this intricate diagram. At the top of the diagram is the Jungfrau Sophia, the Virgin Sophia. So, if we think in Proverbs 9, for instance, she's the handmaid of God who helps him in the creation of all things. So and she's wisdom, right? So her wisdom governs all these things, or she is God's wisdom, which governs all things. But so she's at the top of this diagram, and there's this network of stuff. And at the very bottom is this little sphere, and it says silex, right? Which is flint. Why? Well, what's a flint for? I have someplace in my house a flint and a striker, so you can make fire when you don't have matches. So the idea in Hermeticism or Rosicrucianism is that nowhere in nature is spirit not present. Likewise, nowhere in the spiritual world is matter absent, even though there may be places like in a flint where spirit is at a minimum, and places like in the Jungfrau Sophia where matter is at a minimum, but they're never absent from one another. Right? This is an important thing, and this is what makes them traditionalists. So I'll let you look at that for a second here, and then we'll come back and talk more. So kind of interesting, right? So from there, let's take a look at his poetry. And the first poem he, proper, even after the dedication and what do they call it? The paratexts, as we'll call them. But the first proper poem in the body of the first part of Silex Scintillans is the poem Regeneration. And and he doesn't get anthologized all that much, but this is one of his more anthologized poems. And let us read the first stanza. A ward and still in bonds, one day I stole abroad. It was high spring, and all the way primrosed and hung with shade. Yet was it frost within, and surly winds blasted my infant buds, and sin, like clouds, eclipsed my mind. Now, what's the first thing you notice here? Especially when we compare it to the other metaphysical poets. I'll continue. Stormed thus. I straight perceive my spring mere stage and show, my walk a monstrous mountain thing, rough cast with rocks and snow. And as a pilgrim's eye, far from relief, measures the melancholy sky, then drops and rains for grief, so sighed I upwards. Still, at last, twixt steps and falls, I reached the pinnacle, where placed I found a pair of scales. I took them up and laid in the one late pains, the other smoke and pleasures weighed, but proved the heavier grains. Now, notice in that first and second stanzas, there's so much nature involved, which is kind of interesting. Now, I don't think at the time that he wrote this, but afterwards, Henry became a physician, a Paracelsian physician, which is the 17th century version of alternative medicine. And nobody is even sure if he really took a medical degree, but he was definitely practicing medicine for his long life. He lived to be 73. He's this physician, and Paracelsus, right? Paracelsus is interested in the doctrine of signatures, the signature of all things, signaturum rerum, right? Which is so if you see something like hepatica or liverwort, it's called. Well, it's called that because it's shaped like a liver, and the assumption from Paracelsus in this tradition of medicine, which later found its way into homeopathy, is that this is a signature. It's showing us that there's a relationship between this plant and the liver. So if we take this for the liver, it will help. That's how homeopathy works. It's how biodynamic farming works. So interesting that nature is so much a part of this poetry, which is unlike not just any of the metaphysical poets, but any of the poetry that was going on at this time. Now, to what could we attribute that? I have different thoughts about it. One definitely is his Paracelsian training, or Paracelsian interest, the interest that would lead him to Paracelsus, right? And to nature, and to paying attention to nature. But also, I think, from growing up in rural Wales. It seems to have, there's a little bit more in Vaughan of this relation of awareness of nature that is not merely decorative. Even in Shakespeare doesn't seem to have much of he talks about things, but even when he talks about plants, there's no relationship to them. They're decorative in a way. But not with Vaughan. And notice also in the third stanza, so sighed I upwards. At last, twixt steps and falls, I reached the pinnacle, where placed I found a pair of scales, which has almost become surrealism. He finds a pair of scales on this mountain walk. I took them up and laid in the one late pains, the other smoke, and pleasures weighed, but proved the heavier grains. And keep going. With that some cried away, straight I obeyed, and led full east. A fair, fresh field could spy. Some called it Jacob's bed, a virgin soil, which no rude feet e'er trod, where since he stepped there only go prophets and friends of God. So, and he's drawing on the Jacob's ladder, and later Jacob's wrestling with the angel in Genesis, because this is also kind of a mystical insight triggered by nature. And for the Vaughns and for Jakob Burma is, and for sociology, you could say, that, and this is a word that comes through in Vaughn's poetry, shine. Is a splendor, is a shining through nature. The supernatural, the spiritual shines through the natural, which speaks to us of God. And that's what Henry Vaughan, that's where he is in his poetry. And I won't read the whole thing because it's a long poem, but just read the 5th stanza and then we'll look at the end. Here I repose, but scarce well set, a grove descried of stately height, whose branches met and mixed on every side. I entered, and once in, amazed to see it, found all was changed, and a new spring did all my senses greet. Right? The unthrift sun shot vital gold 1,000 pieces, and heaven its azure did unfold. See, this is what I'm talking about. This splendor, it's just shining through. And it's shining through nature, and it's shining through this poem, which is, I mean, it's kind of splendid. It's the perfect word for it, right? And then, I won't read the whole thing, but you notice at the end, and very often in Vaughn's poems, he'll append a verse from Scripture, and the verse he appends here is from Canticle or Song of Songs 5:17. Arise, O north wind, and come thou south wind, and blow upon my garden, that the spices thereof may flow out. Right. So with Vaughan, what I sense is that it's like, almost like a braid. Right. There's nature, the poet, and God or Scripture. They're all intertwined. They interpenetrate one another, and it goes throughout his poetry. So it's fun. I mean, pretty extraordinary poem. And then he does this in another poem. I won't read the whole thing. The poem "Religion," which is also in part 1, and we'll do part 1 today and part 2 the next time. And here, "Religion," he starts out all about nature. My God, when I walk in those groves, and leaves that thy spirit doth still fan, I see in each shade there that grows an angel talking with a man. Almost like Blake. Under a juniper, some house, or the cool myrtle's canopy. Others beneath an oak's green boughs, or at some fountain's bubbling eye. Here Jacob dreams and wrestles. There Elias by a raven is fed. Another time by the angel where he brings him water with his bread. In Abram's tent, with winged guests, oh, how familiar that was, then was heaven. Eat, drink, discourse, sit down and rest, until the cool and shady even. Nay, thou thyself, my God, in fire, whirlwind, and clouds, and the soft voice, speaks there so much that I admire we have no conference in these days. Right? A very absolutely mystical relationship to creation. And certainly even more than with Herbert. Herbert, his is an interior world. It's inside the church. It's not about nature. But and we saw with Crashaw, who's this ecstatic Marian poet, another aspect to that dynamic. But here, we see Herbert's inside and Vaughan is outside. He's in nature. And nature speaks to him, and God speaks to him through nature. At least that's the world he's creating for us. And he does it. I mean, once you see that, you can't stop seeing it through his poetry. The first time I tried to read his poetry, I was probably about 22, and I made the mistake of trying to read his collected works from the beginning, which is a bad idea because his first book, Oler Iskanos, is not nearly as good as Silex Scintillans. It was before his conversion, and he was writing the kind of verse you write at college. It was workshop poetry. But with his conversion, man, something happened to this man. And so let's look at the poem "Corruption." And how many do I only have two more before we stop. Corruption. Sure it was so. Man in those early days was not all stone and earth. He shined a little, and by those weak rays had some glimpse of his birth. That's the key to his poetry right there. Man in those early days was not all stone and earth. He shined a little. Do we shine a little? And this is actually going back to Terrence Malick in the same film, The Thin Red Line. Terrence, if you know Terrence Malick, tell him to get a hold of me. Terrence Malick, I think, is the most sophological, metaphysical filmmaker alive, probably maybe ever. And at the end of The Thin Red Line, when the private is speaking in voiceover as the boys, the soldiers are leaving Guadalcanal, and he looks out there, and the last thing he says is, "Oh, my soul, let me see through you now," I think he says. All things shining, even in war. Right? That's a very Vaughn insight. It's a very sociological insight that Malick brings there. He shined a little. And that's, speaking of shining, this light that they're talking about. And I think, this is in the Hermetic philosophy and Rosicrucian philosophy, this is a central insight. Look at the Genesis story of creation, right? First day, what's created? Light. Let there be light. And there was light. But the sun and the moon aren't created till the fourth day. So the light that Vaughn is talking about is not the sunlight. It's the light of the first day. And this is also a important insight and feature in the philosophy of Robert Flood, who was contemporary of the Vaughns. He was a little bit older than they were. He was probably 40 years old when they were born, but contemporary, nevertheless. And that's one of his insights. And I'm sure the Vaughan brothers, and I know Thomas, Henry, we have to guess. Thomas for sure read Flood because he quotes him. And I imagine if your twin brother reads something, he's going to at least tell you about it. So anyway, that's I don't want to do the whole thing. We could do every poem in the book, and I could go on and on and on and on and on about it. But I prefer not to at this moment. But let's look at another one of his poems, one of his more anthologized poems, "The World," which is toward the end of Silas St. Tillman's. Part 1, I should say. I saw eternity the other night, like a great ring of pure and endless light, all calm as it was bright, and round beneath it, time and hours, days, years, driven by the spheres, like a vast shadow moved, in which the world and all her train were hurled. The doting lover in his quaintest strain did there complain. Near him, his lute, his fancy, and his flights, wit's sour delights with gloves and knots, the silly snares of pleasure, yet his dear treasure all scattered lay. I think he's talking about himself before his sickness, while he his eyes did pour upon a flower. But here's eternity, right? What an image. It's like he sees the workings of the universe. And then, the next stanza. The darksome statesman hung with weights and woe like a thick midnight fog, moved there so slow he did nor stay nor go. Condemning thoughts like sad eclipses scowl upon his soul, and clouds of crying witnesses without pursued him with one shout. Yet dig the mole, and lest his ways be found, worked underground, where he did clutch his prey. But one did see that policy. Churches and altars fed him. Perjuries were gnats and flies. It rained about him blood and tears, but he drank them as free. Whoa, where did that come from? We went from, he sees eternity the other night. Then the next thing he sees is the darksome statesman. Well, I wouldn't say consensus, but some critics, and I am one of them, think he's talking about Oliver Cromwell. And being an an Irish Catholic boy, we don't love Oliver Cromwell too much. So I'm all into this. Let's hate on Cromwell, but I think he is talking about Cromwell because that's Cromwell was the head of the Puritans, in the ones who were tearing what Vaughan took to be the world apart, right? And it was just it's a kind of so it's a way it's kind of a political moment. It's an absolutely political moment in this poem, if that's who he's talking about, and I think he is. And I'll skip to the fourth. Yet some who all this while did weep and sing and weep, soared up into the ring, sorry. But most would use no wing. O fools, said I, thus to prefer dark night before true light, to live in grots and caves and hate the day because it shows the way which from this dead and dark abode leads up to God, a way where you might tread the sun and be more bright than he, shining, right? But as I did their madness so discuss, one whispered thus, this ring the bridegroom did for none provide, but for his bride. Now it could be that he's talking about election in a Calvinist sense. I don't think that's what he's talking about, because who were the Calvinists? The Puritans were more Calvinist than Vaughan was. But trying to make sense. And I love that it's really kind of not resolved. It's kind of let God worry about it at the end. And I think that his closing epigraph from St. John, it's important. All that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. Right? So the world versus eternity. Those are the polarities in this poem. And let's see what we got. One more. Well, one more, and then we'll continue next time. This poem is the sap. It's almost one of the last poems in part one. And I'll read it until I want to talk. Come, sapless blossom, creep not still on earth, forgetting thy first birth. 'Tis not from dust, or if so, why dost thou thus call and thirst for dew? It tends not thither, if it doth. Why then this growth and stretch for heaven? Thy root sucks but diseases, worms there seat and claim it for their meat. Who placed thee here? Did something then infuse which now can tell the news? There is beyond the stars an hill of myrrh, from which some drops fall here. On it the Prince of Salem sits, who deals to thee thy secret meals. There is thy country, and he is the way, and hath withal the key. Yet lived he here sometimes, and bore for thee a world of misery. For thee, when the first man's loins didst fall from that hill to this vale, and had not he done so, it is most true 2 deaths had been thy due. But going hence, and knowing well what woes might his friends discompose, to show in what strange love he had to our good, he gave his sacred blood. By will our sap and cordial, now in this lies such a heaven of bliss, that who but truly tastes it, no decay can touch him any way. Such secret life and virtue in it lies, it will exalt and rise, and actuate such spirits as are shed, or ready to be dead, and bring new too. Get then this sap, and get good store of it. But let the vessel where you put it be for sure, to be all your power most pure. There is at all times thus shut up in you a powerful rare dew, which only grief and love extract. With this be sure, and never miss, to wash your vessel well. Then humbly take this balm for souls that ache. And one who drank it thus assures that you shall find a joy so true, such perfect ease, and such a lively sense of grace against all sins, that you'll confess the comfort such as even brings to and comes from heaven. So many things going on. One thing I think he's working with is the palm, or the sap is the elixir, right? The elixir is something the alchemists were in search of, this medicine that can cure all ailments, right? But what is he really talking? What's the real elixir here? Well, I want to say well, there's certainly a Eucharistic element to it. He's talking about the blood of Christ, right? But he's also talking about that shining we talked about earlier. Right? It's that which is always present. Right? Such secret life and virtue in it lies, it will exalt and rise and actuate such spirits as are shed or ready to be dead. Right? This is the shining. Right? And no decay can come to you. Now, does it mean you won't die? That's not. And this is his theme, especially in this first part of Salix Scintillans, is regeneration. Right? The regeneration of the Christian. We could even add the regeneration of culture, which is probably one of Vaughn's purposes for writing this book, is to help to regenerate culture. Because he lived in a time of civil war. Many of his friends died in that war, on the losing side. His brother lost his job. Not a good time. So that's probably good for today. And when next we get together, we'll talk about part 2 of Salix Scintillans, which is a little bit kind of a different book in some ways. Okay, I'll see you then.